We're here today with Diane Gavey, a friend of mine for many years, and Diane's here to tell us her story of how she became a Christian. And so Diane, it's great to have you here with us today.
Thank you.
Perhaps one of the reasons I love interviewing you so much is that it's quite personal for me. It's quite a personal experience that I had as part of a youth group because we were praying for you to become a Christian. I remember distinctly being 14, 15, sitting in a small back room at the back of a bookshop actually. Do you remember that? That bookshop in Pontefract, yes. West Yorkshire. And we were praying as young people for you to become a Christian, and then amazingly you were saved. And it was very real, and I think it's probably one of the first times that I'd seen how God answers prayer in that way. So it's always great to interview you, and it brings that personal excitement for me again to hear your story. So it's all good stories. Let's start at the beginning. Tell us a little bit about your background, Diane, where you're from, and just what the early years were like. Were you brought up in a Christian home and so on?
Okay, it's really good to be here, Rachel. We go back a long time. But yes, I was brought up in a Catholic family, and so even from being born, my parents took me to Catholic church.
Was church an exciting place to go? Did you feel it was something you wanted to be on a Sunday?
Actually, as a child, it seemed pretty boring for me, and so I was always eager for the service to finish and to go home. But I had this deal with my father, who said when I get to the age of 16, then after that I could decide whether to continue going there or whether to leave. And of course, at the time I was a teenager, my desire was to leave the church completely. And I actually remember saying, I will never ever go into a church again.
Did you believe God was real? Did you have a belief in him?
To be honest with you, I never gave it much thought until I was 13 years old. I probably would say in front of my family I denied God existed, but I thought there must be a creator. Although I thought he was very distant and had nothing really to do with us at all. That's what I would have said.
Yeah. And at 13 there was quite a significant event in your life that impacted you.
That's true. It was very traumatic for me when I was about 13 years old. My grandma was very close to her, and so I would frequently go and stay with them over weekends, and that was a great time in my life when I spent time with them. But she had a heart attack, and sadly over a period of days, I can't remember exactly how long she suffered, but we expected her to recover from this, and I went to stay. I remember doing a jigsaw. I remember my grandfather asleep in his chair, and then I had this very strange sound coming from the bedroom, and it made me really nervous. I was quite nervous, but I ran to the room to see what happened, and I found my grandma had died. So that was very traumatic for me, and so I was the one. I had to wake my granddad up to tell him, and then the rest of the family got to find out what had happened to her. And so, that really actually was the beginning, I think, of my journey of trying to find meaning in life.
Because you suddenly were facing the reality of death.
Absolutely.
And most people at 13 aren't particularly thinking about death, but that's for you true. That was a trigger for you to start thinking more about eternal things and about what happens after this life.
That's true. It really did make me think. She went so suddenly, in my opinion, that I wondered when will I die and how. I was only 13. Most of the teenagers don't even think. You're thinking about your careers, you're thinking about your future. But when I saw that happen, it made me wonder, where did she go? What happened to her? What about, is there such a thing as heaven and hell? Does God really exist? I questioned all these things. And actually, I developed a fear of death. And even going to bed at night was traumatic. Because she died, we think in her sleep probably, I found that going to bed was the most difficult thing for me to do, because you're not in control of that. Actually, we're not in control of anything really. But I was going to sleep, fighting sleep, because I was fearful that I might die in my sleep.
So how did you get through that period of time, and did you find the answers that you were looking for?
Sure, I didn't at that point. I was hoping there would be an answer to this question I had, the reality of heaven and hell, or even God's existence. I was hoping that I could find answers to these questions. Where did I go? How could I find out the answer to these questions? I didn't know that I could go to the church and ask them at that point. But
didn't look in the Bible?
I didn't have a Bible. I didn't even think, considering I was brought up in a Catholic church, you would have thought that I would maybe go there or begin to ask the questions. But I was quiet and shy in those days, and I felt a little bit of shame that I was even thinking like this. So my response to that was to absorb myself in lots of activities during the day, and then at the weekends. As a teenager, I got involved in the nightclub scene, and so a lot of drinking took place. And a lot of that was because I wanted to block out all these things going through my mind, and to find, what was the purpose of life. If I was going to die, there must be a reason why I'm alive. And I wanted to know what that was, but I didn't have the answers.
So how eventually did you get the answers that you were looking for?
Yes, I mean, it took some years actually, and it was when I was about 19, I met this guy, a friend of mine, got involved in a relationship with him, and actually went through a very dark time in his life, and he tried to kill himself.
Whilst you were going out with him?
Yes, that's right.
Wow, that's
so
hard.
Imagine trying to deal with that situation as well. Again, the contrast of my grandma dying naturally, and then my boyfriend wanting to kill himself was a big thing. Again, facing the reality of death. Yeah. And if he'd have succeeded, what would have happened? Wow. But actually, that day was a miracle in my eyes. I began to realise that God had saved him. Even though I didn't have a real reason to believe that, no one had talked to me about these things, but I thought God saved him. It was within half an hour of dying, and God intervened and saved him. And through that, it became a believer. So that had a big impact in my life at that time.
And so he was a believer, but you weren't at this time.
That's right.
Was that difficult? Was he sort of trying to tell you now how to think and believe?
Yes. I mean, it's quite an interesting thing, because actually his parents also, especially his father, became a believer through going to a meeting, and he was transformed overnight. So I think that affected my boyfriend, and also he began to talk to me, and I began to ask many questions about life and death and about Christianity, because I really was very ignorant about what Christianity really was, about what a Christian really was. I had no idea. So imagine, brought up in a Catholic family, so I'm going out with this boyfriend who becomes a believer, says that I'm not a Christian, and so it actually turned my world upside down. And so I was confused. What's a Christian? Yeah. Is it someone that goes to church? Or is it something else? And he was saying it was something else, and I'd never heard that message before. Yeah.
So then you went to a church meeting. There was an outreach in Wakefield city centre.
Amazing.
So you went along to an amazing place to have a meeting, and you went along. And what was the message you heard there, Diane, that changed your world?
That's right. What I remember from that meeting, and it's a long time ago, actually, I remember just hearing the message of the cross, and why Jesus came, why he had to die on the cross. And I knew I've heard the story before, but actually it impacted me in a much deeper way. I realised that Jesus came and he died on the cross for my sin. And as the preacher talked for about 15 or 20 minutes, he unravelled what my sin was. And it wasn't things I expected, like murder and other things we might consider to be big sins, but it was about lying, cheating, stealing, other things. And I thought, well, I've done all those things, and it was like I was hearing for the first time that actually my sins is going to be the thing that condemns me to hell. So I have every reason to fear, because at that point I was going to hell, and I knew it. But when I heard that now God sent his son to be a sacrifice for our sins, I realised that actually what I've been looking for all my life, a meaning and an answer to my question about death, that if I put my trust in him, if I believe that Jesus died for my sin on the cross, then I was going to heaven. I mean, that's great news. You know, it was such a relief, you know, just to hear that message of hope, that I needn't fear death anymore, you know, because Jesus conquered death for us. And if I really put my trust in him, then there's no reason to go to hell. So the message is for all of us. But I heard it for myself the first time, and I believed it. So that was the turning point in my life, the beginning of a turning point in my life.
And how did it impact your life? How did your life change from that moment down?
Sure. I mean, I just remember leaving the meeting thinking something has happened to me on the inside, but I didn't even know what that was until a few months later, when I began to explore more about what Christianity is all about, how you can become a Christian, and so from that I realized that, yeah, it's a journey, and only 3 months later did I have any kind of assurance that, or certainty that actually I was no longer on the road to hell, not because of what I did, but what Christ did for me, and I trusted that, and that actually changed my whole life. Before, I was so quiet. Rachel, I don't know if you remember, but in the early days, you know...
We can't believe it now.
You know, I know. But I was so quiet, and even my parents would say this, I think too, you know, I'd hardly talk. And I was a very nervous person, but God changed my heart, and he gave me confidence. And I began to talk a lot more than I used to, and became really interested in telling others about Jesus, because that's the only answer to everything in our lives. We go through difficult times in our lives, through depression, through loss of a loved one, through some kind of suffering. But without Christ, you know, there is no hope. So even in those times, I know that God is with me. And I do have problems, and I do still struggle with some things in life. But I know, and I can talk to my Heavenly Father every day and tell him how I feel. And in those early days, I had no one to run to, but now I have a friend who knows me inside out and accepts me for who I am, and I can go to him with every problem that I have. That's great news.
And if there was someone listening in today who wants to know, how do I become a Christian? There's no magical formula, there's no set thing someone has to do. What would you advise someone who says, actually, I've heard your story, Diane,
That's right.
and I would love that faith you've got. Is that possible? Sure. What should someone do, Diane?
Of course, you know, again, I believe if that's the desire of your heart, then please call out on God, because he wants to reveal himself to us. And he did that when I called on him. He heard my cry, you know. And even now when I think about it, all those years ago, I'm still emotional about it, because seriously, I was going nowhere. And yeah, I was going to hell actually, and life is short, but it's just a prayer away. All you have to do, if there's anything to do at all, is to call upon him, and he knows your heart and your desire, and he will answer your prayer if you come to him. So I would recommend, if you're in the same position like I was, just call on him and he will answer your prayer. I'm convinced of that.
Diane, it's great to have a coffee with you as ever.
You too, thank you.
We'll have a biscuit now.
Okay,
and
great.
Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you too.